Hi, my name is Matthew Pinsker. I'm a historian, and here are a few things you need to know to sound smart about the Dred Scott case. This is the story of a husband and a wife, two enslaved people who both filed for freedom in circuit court in St. Louis, Missouri in 1846 and set off an 11-year odyssey that culminated in 1857 in the most infamous decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. Dred Scott was held as a slave by a family that moved him first to Alabama and then to Missouri. And then he was sold to another man named John Emerson, who took him to Wisconsin Territory, present-day Minnesota, where he was held at Fort Snelling. There he met Harriet Robinson, who was the slave of an Indian agent. They married, they had 2 daughters, and then John Emerson owned both of them and their children, took them back to St. Louis. That's when, in 1846, Dred and Harriet Scott filed freedom suits in St. Louis Circuit Court. They knew that there was a doctrine in state courts called once free, always free. If you were an enslaved person held in free territory, like the Wisconsin Territory, then you should be freed even in a slave state like Missouri. That 11-year odyssey took them all the way up to the Supreme Court, the one that ruled against Dred Scott in 1857. The ruling had 3 main parts. First, it said that blacks did not have rights in federal courts as federal citizens. Second, it said that slave states no longer had to honor the once free, always free doctrine. And third, it said that Congress never should have prohibited slavery in the Wisconsin Territory in the first place, or in any territories. It was a dramatic blow in the sectional crisis. It created a huge firestorm of controversy, and ultimately is one of the leading causes of the coming of the Civil War. Even though the Scotts lost their case in court, they actually won their freedom. The children of Scott's original owners, some of them in St. Louis, had become anti-slavery. They had helped fund the Scotts' legal case for many years, and now in 1857 they stepped up and bought the family and then freed them. Dred Scott lived another year, but he lived as a free man. His wife and their 2 daughters lived the rest of their lives as freed people. There are still descendants of the Scott family in America today. Despite the tragedy of the case and its infamous nature, there was a human triumph within it. Hi, my name is Matthew Pinsker. I'm a historian, and here are a few things you need to know to sound smart about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The Lincoln and Douglas debates of 1858 are famous in American political lore. Abraham Lincoln versus Stephen Douglas, they were enemies, political rivals. But what you might not realize is that the debates themselves started because they very nearly became allies. The story has to do with the crisis over Kansas. Douglas, the senator from Illinois, a Democrat, had become engaged in a bitter feud with the Democratic president, James Buchanan. They were arguing over something called the Lecompton Constitution, which emerged at the end of 1857 as a kind of fraudulent pro-slavery document that would confirm the spread of slavery into the Kansas Territory. And so Douglas and Buchanan began to engage in a very public feud over what to do. Republicans in the East saw an opportunity to convince Stephen Douglas to switch parties, to become part of the anti-slavery Northern Party that was now calling itself the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln and his allies in Illinois, men who had known Douglas for years and despised him in many ways, didn't trust him, they were determined to stop this. So they gathered together and, in an unprecedented fashion, nominated Abraham Lincoln as their unanimous first choice to be their nominee to compete against Stephen Douglas for U.S. Senate. Then Lincoln went to Douglas and proposed a series of what he called joint discussions. He wanted to have over 50 joint discussions. Douglas agreed to 7 joint discussions across different congressional districts around the state. The opening speaker would have an hour. The next speaker would have an hour and a half, and the opening speaker would come back for a final half-an-hour rebuttal. 3 hours of political talk. All they talked about, the focus of their discussions, those 21 hours of debates, was the fate of slavery in America. But in some cases, 10 to 15,000 Illinois farmers and citizens would gather around to try to listen to this debate. At the end of the day, the Republicans won more votes than the Democrats in that election across Illinois. But because of districting issues and holdover seats, Lincoln lost in his bid to replace Douglas. And yet it's clear that in those Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln won something really important. He was the one who had the debates published in the subsequent year. And those debates and the publication and dissemination of his views is what helped make him a stronger national candidate and ultimately the Republican nominee for president in 1860.
Young people in large numbers came out and joined what became known as the Red Guards. These largely terroristic organizations were used to publicly humiliate, assault, and in some cases, even murder political enemies of Mao and the Communist Party.